I want to give you a little bit of background about where our beliefs and policies came from. And as I talk about it, you'll see that I'm being certainly European-centric and even more specifically British-centric. And that's not because those are the best policies or certainly not the only policies, but it's because in our country, the United States, we adopted most heavily our policies from that tradition. And so in order to understand why we are where we are, why we have the policies we have, that's the tradition that we need to understand. But I hasten to add that you might want to explore the policies that have developed in other countries, in other parts of the world, as a contrast to what we do, and for suggestions of what alternatives might be available if we decide we don't like the policies we have as much as we thought we would. So in the feudal period, we saw a system, a status that was really based on where you lived. And it was also based on the notion that people were born into a certain position and they would remain in that position their entire lives. It was no one's role to change anyone's status. So you were born as a worker, as part of the nobility, or as part of the small tradescraft group of people. And you expected to stay there, and not only did you expect to stay in that position, but you expected your children would and your children's children would. It was part of how the world was structured. And this was supported by the religion of the time, by the government of the time, and many people, most people in fact, believed that that was true. So it answers some of the key questions. This was a belief system that said people would not change their status. It wasn't anybody's role to help them change their status, and that your humanity and the responsibility of systems towards any individual were really based on whether you were where you had been born and were doing the work you had been born to do, with a couple of exceptions. So there was a role for charity, but it tended to be charity given to people who could visibly and obviously no longer work. So it might be to very young orphans, it might be to elderly who were frail, it might be to people who were visibly disabled. And I keep emphasizing the visibility of it because it was something that had to be proved, in a sense. You had to show your inability to work in order to warrant being helped, often by the church or by the manse or the hierarchy of wherever you were living. A few phenomena interfered with the feudal system. The first was the bubonic plague, which went across Europe, affected all of Europe, and killed almost a third of the population. This left every place in Europe short of workers to keep up the farming, the agriculture, and the very beginnings of what was to become the Industrial Revolution. We also saw the beginnings, the tendrils of that Industrial Revolution as people began developing manufacturing processes that could employ people and could produce goods and services that could be sold for money rather than bartered and rather than made in a subsistence mode. So, what happened then? We saw a whole change in social policy and what it was supposed to accomplish. Because for the first time, we didn't want people, I say we by meaning the leadership of the country, didn't want people to stay still. We needed them to move into cities, and we needed them desperately to work. So with this in place, we saw put into position and the Elizabethan Poor Laws. And we act like that was a date in the early 1600s, and then these laws emerged. But they'd been developing for centuries after the plague and as the Industrial Revolution got underway. And the Elizabethan Poor Laws are actually represented by 4 institutions that were encased in law. The first was almshouses. Almshouses were for the poor who were, in the policy sense, deserving. They were defined as deserving because they had a visible reason not to be able to work. And again, the state stood behind and the church stood behind offering services through the almshouses. It was very important at that time that the almshouses be sufficiently unpleasant that people would not try to get into them unless they were in desperate need. The second kind of institution that people developed as a result of the Elizabethan Poor Laws were workhouses. Okay, workhouses were the other side. This is where people went if they would not work, but were considered able-bodied and able to work. And the workhouses forced work. So you were actually enclosed in them, provided with work, and forced to work in order to receive food, clothing, and the shelter that the workhouse offered. The workhouses were probably marginally less pleasant than the almshouses. The third institution that was developed through the Elizabethan Poor Laws was the jail or prison. And we saw this develop as a way of punishing people who were considered intractable in workhouses or were caught violating work-only rules, in a sense, because they were caught begging, or they were caught leaving employment and trying to travel to find better work, which was also outlawed. And the fourth was the system for dealing with impoverished children, children who needed to be trained up to work for the rest of their lives, but who were not in families, were often picked off the streets for begging, and they went into forced apprenticeships. And that was designed to make them work and make them work ready for the rest of their lives. So we see encapsulated in these institutions that were the result of the Elizabethan Poor Laws answers to our questions. Who's human? Who deserves help? People who work. What is the responsibility of the state? It is to provide the avenue to work and then to insist on work. And so we see values that are answers to our questions. Who is human? Who deserves help? What is the role of the state? And can people change their status? Embedded in the structure of these institutions. Because this was one of the first major social policies in this British tradition, and because it was done in the form of institutions, we can see there the seeds of what we do today. So if you examine our policies today, our poverty policies, our social welfare policies, you will see similar structures that try to divide the deserving poor from the undeserving poor, that try to enforce work as the ends to which all of these means are designed, and that will decide when and whether and how people can actually negotiate for better work or must stay with the work they have. The period of Enlightenment, as represented in my mind by the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, really changed public thinking about a lot of the issues we've talked about. Citizens became very important. Children and their development became very important. Rights as well as responsibilities became very important. And we saw this encapsulated in laws and institutions that were different from those that preceded. We saw, and I'm going to talk in a little more detail in a minute, we saw the development of organizations of workers, both in terms of guilds, workshops, communes, and in terms of labor unions. We saw the development of education, not just as a service to the very wealthy, but as a right that all children deserved. We saw the beginning of child welfare laws, that children had to be treated within certain bounds, even within their own families, as well as in the institutions to which they were entered. All of these things came out of this shift in thinking that changed some of the answers we had to the key fundamental questions of who is human, who deserves help, how does the state provide help, and can people change the status to which they were born?